What's up, friends? Now, I just finished filming an epic 3-part mega series on all things muscle hypertrophy. So today I thought I would give you a very condensed version of parts 1 and 2, the physiology of that big 3-part series. If you want to see more about what's in those other videos, you can see the outlines here. I'm not going to cover all this ground in this particular video, but I wanted you to see what you're missing in the other ones. Okay, this is the video, the part 1, where I cover the physiology. Part 2 is what we call the mechanism. So what are the signals that tell you to grow muscle? And then part 3 is a practical application. So eating and training and all that stuff. Now, what's particularly special about this series is we've learned so much new information in the last 3 years. If you haven't really been paying attention, you probably have missed some things or you're a little bit behind. So I wanted to make this big series so you can all be as up to date as humanly possible. Well, let's go ahead and jump right into it then and talk a little bit of the condensed version of the physiology of muscle hypertrophy. So if you want to know about how muscle grows, we have to first understand what's in muscle. We know that the things that you look at on the outside are actually a composite of millions of individual muscle fibers. And if we were to go in with a little needle, get my joke there, take some of that muscle sample out, this is what it would look like. And this is that process I'm describing. This is called a skeletal muscle biopsy. You can see the needle right there, and that little red part in the middle is the actual muscle sample. So it's about 100 milligrams or so, and this is a fairly painless and not very difficult procedure to recover from. I've done it thousands of times. Well, that's a lie. Hundreds of times. Maybe close to 1,000. And if I were to pull that little red thing out of the middle and line it all up like that, this is what you would see. In fact, the picture there is from a world champion athlete, and I won't tell you any more about who that is. And there's probably a couple of 1,000 fibers in what you're seeing there. Looks pretty high grade, right? So if you're to take that tissue and put it in a petri dish here, the color kind of goes away for a bunch of reasons you don't care about, but you can see right up here, these are a bunch of individual muscle fibers. I don't have the time to get into it today, but you can see very quickly what it would look like under a microscope. So I've dyed the muscle green here, and then watch up at the top. I will pull out 2 individual muscle fibers from that little bundle. And it's as easy as that, okay? I'll actually separate them for you so you can see them one by one. In fact, if I were able to hold that up, you could see them with your naked eye. So they're pretty big. The muscle cells, skeletal muscle is some of the largest cells in all of biology, especially the ones in humans. So they're very, very unique like that. So if you can imagine an entire muscle, pick whichever one is your favorite, your gastroc, your soleus, your rectus abdominis, I don't care. And that's that blue circle. Like we said, in the middle is thousands or millions, well, certainly at this point, millions of individual muscle fibers. And those are wrapped together into groups with connective tissue, and we call those groups fascicles. Now, I'm going to get rid of that for now because it's not super important, but I do want to acknowledge that's really how the muscle works. So within each individual muscle cell, we have a bunch of what are called myofibrils. And then within each individual myofibril, you have a whole bunch of what are called myofilaments. Okay, and this is if you've been to exercise physiology class, these would be your actin and your myosin. Now in the part 1, when I go into depth, I'll explain a lot about what's actually growing, how and where and why. But I'm going to hit the highlights here. Okay, like I said, this is a different image just so you can conceptualize the whole muscle, the fascicle, the muscle fibers, all the way down to those myofibrils, as well as the actin and myosin. And those form what we call sarcomeres. Okay, so this is a little more in-depth look of that myosin and the actin. And the way that your muscle contracts is through a process we call the sliding filament theory, where basically you use some energy, your myosin reaches up, grabs actin, and pulls it to the center line. So it goes like that, pulls everything closer together, your muscle stacks up. And like I said, this is an actual image of an individual muscle fiber. The horizontal thing, this is real. This is, of course, made in PowerPoint, but this is actually real. And the cells themselves are quite large. This is a different way to look at it. This is in cross-section. So now each individual circle is a muscle fiber. And you can see this is from my colleague, Jimmy Bagley. And the green ones are the fast-twitch fibers. The yellowish ones are the slow-twitch fibers. And what we know is generally the fast-twitch fibers are bigger, especially with strength training. Now there is some natural variability person to person, so not all fast-twitch fibers are always larger than slow-twitch fibers. But generally that's the case. In fact, one of the things Jimmy and I have seen quite consistently is if you do a lot of steady state, long duration endurance training, it's pretty common for those type 1 fibers to be equal, if not larger, than the type 2 fast twitch fibers. Okay, but in general, the fast twitch fibers respond pretty well to strength training. They like to grow, all right, if they're activated. And the slow twitch ones grow as well, but perhaps not as specific. But there's some detail behind that we have to get to. So what's actually growing? Well, you have really two possible options. If your bicep is bigger now after 2 months of training hard, either one of two general things happened. The fibers got longer or the fibers got wider. And so if we look at what longer would mean, you can see the image. I think this is a great job from a recent review article that's free, by the way. You can look at this title and go read this article if you want. And it explains in great detail what muscle hypertrophy really is. Great work by Stu Phillips and Troy Hornberger, just fantastic researchers in the field. But nonetheless, you can imagine because each individual muscle cell does not run the entire length of the whole muscle. So your biceps, say one of the brachialis or brachioradialis, whichever one you wanted, okay, the muscle might run from there to there. But the fibers don't run from there. They only maybe go halfway or a third or a quarter or something like that. And so you can see the image being depicted here. If they actually grew in length, that would actually increase the diameter of the muscle cell. So that's one possible option. And we would generally call that increasing sarcomere in series. So those sarcomeres I talked about where the myosin actin run, you would stack them up in series and the fibers would grow longer. Now, important distinction. This does not mean your muscle is getting longer, just the muscle fibers within them. Okay? In order to actually grow your muscle longer, you're going to have to do some pretty crazy things. It's not going to be a normal response to hypertrophy training. So if we come to we'll build a little scorecard here, we'll see that length, okay, yes, it kind of happens there, but there is some detail that we're not exactly sure about, and it's not a muscle getting longer, it's the fibers that are possibly getting longer. Going to option number 2, which is what we call the diameter. In the scientific field, this would be called also radial or cross-sectional area. I'll use diameter from here on out, but those are what those terms are if you come across them in the research. And we know very clearly, and there is abundant research to show this is very common finding, okay? The fibers will increase in diameter. What we don't know exactly is how that's happening, and that's what that whole part 1 video is. It's like an hour and describing what we know specifically about how it grows in diameter. I'll give you the short version here. So option 1, with increasing the diameter of the whole muscle, is if you increase the number of fibers within it. Okay, now you have a couple of options to do that. So you can see from the image, if you had, say, 5 fibers, your whole muscle would be that thick, but if you had 6 fibers, it'd be thicker. Pretty obvious to understand how that would work. 7, you get even thicker and thicker. So by increasing the number of fibers, you increase the diameter of the whole muscle. Well, it turns out that's what we call hyperplasia, and it's probably fairly unlikely. And I remember being taught that it's impossible and thinking, really? I don't think the story is quite that easy. And that was over 20 years ago. And I've been actually on record everywhere you can imagine talking about hyperplasia and the fact that I just never thought it was impossible. Well, we've learned some things in the last just couple of years that dramatically increased our understanding of hyperplasia. And so here's what we're looking at. If you go back to our basic schematic and you have the whole muscle there, all the individual muscle fibers, all the myofibrils within it, and then the myofilaments. Hyperplasia would be if you just added new fibers. And that's probably fairly unlikely to happen, especially with normal strength training hypertrophy. Now, with aging, puberty and developing as a little baby and stuff like that, okay, it's possible, but we're talking a normal strength training adaptation is probably unlikely. However, there's another concept called fiber splitting or branching. And a recent review article by my friend Kevin has shown that this is a fairly normal response to extreme loading. And you can see that happen right here. This is one individual, this is an image from Kevin's paper. One individual muscle fiber there at the top, and you can see it's starting to branch or split there. So it's not that you're growing a whole new cell, but you could, in theory, be taking one cell and split it into multiple. So the net result would be an increase in total number of fibers. The mechanism, though, is not what we call bona fide hyperplasia. So not growing a new cell, it's splitting. It's a bit of a semantic argument there, but in our field of science, it is an important distinction. Okay, so you'll see this again called splitting or fragmenting or branching or something like that. In fact, if you go back to 2006, there's actually, this has been demonstrated in humans, at least they thought so. Classically, that fiber right there is thought to be a branched or splitted muscle fiber. Now, this is from powerlifters with a known use of anabolic steroids, and we honestly haven't followed this up much at all. So I think there's a lot of questions, I don't think, there's clearly a lot of questions remaining regarding fiber splitting. If you go back to Kevin's paper, we see that it happens with extreme overload. What's that mean exactly? Well, most of our research is coming from animals, like rodents, where we can say, take out their left leg effectively and make them walk only on their right leg for 4 months. Okay, that's extreme overloading, but that's not realistic. So the question we really have is, does this happen with strength training? We don't really know yet, right? We have to get more information on that. I'm going to hedge my bet. I think it does. I don't think it happens in 6 weeks of training. I don't think it happens in 6 months. I do think folks that are 6 years, 10 years, 15 years into the training, I do think they have gone through significant fiber splitting, and they have more fibers. So I don't have that scientifically, but that's my intuition. Okay, regardless, I think we have to say, okay, myofiber and muscle fiber hyperplasia is not impossible. It's probably just very uncommon and not explaining most or even a significant portion of your actual muscle hypertrophy. Okay, but I'll still put it as a question mark because there are a lot of answers we still need. Okay, the other option then to get your muscle bigger, if you're not adding more fibers, is to grow the diameter of the muscle itself. And again, we know that it would look like this. Instead of adding more fibers, you just make each one you have thicker. So if you go back to our similar image here from Troy and Stu's, and as well as Kent, I apologize for not putting you the first time there, Kent, it would look like this. Okay, so we see section B here, probably not likely, that's the fiber splitting, but this is more likely to be the scenario for our radial or diameter growth in muscle fibers. And again, we have seen this now, probably 30, 40, 50 times at least, maybe probably more than that, honestly, in the research. Very highly documented that the muscle fibers themselves increased in diameter. This would be what we call then increasing the sarcomeres in parallel. Okay. Now, it's never actually really been shown, the sarcomere thing, but the muscle fibers get larger. Okay, so the summary to all this is the myofiber, the muscle cell itself, increasing is one of the most long-standing and widely acknowledged contributors of RE or resistance exercise induced muscle hypertrophy. And what we see is somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 35% increase in size after 2 to 3 months or 4 months of training. Now, you wouldn't ever see that much of an increase in the whole muscle size, so we do have a bit of a disassociation between changing the cell size and changing the actual muscle size. So don't get caught up and mixed up if you're reading the research there into how much they actually grew. Okay, so like we said, the real and a lot of the things I laid out in part 1 is the mystery still becomes what's actually growing in the cell itself to make it bigger. It could be what we call myofibrillar hypertrophy. So the myofibers, the yellow things within it, could be growing in size. Okay, we don't necessarily know that yet. It could be an increase in what we call contractile protein accretion. So that would be referring to the myofibrils, the myofilaments, actin and myosin. So maybe you're just adding thicker myosin. In other words, there's a certain amount of protein associated with the myosin filament. Maybe if you make that larger, it grows. That would make then complete sense why oftentimes there is an association between growing more muscle and getting stronger. You have more contractile elements, you make more cross bridges, more force production. Those are very highly associated. It could be sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, which means an increase in the cell size that are coming from the non-contractile units. This would mostly be things like water. And this would explain why, although there's an association between getting bigger and getting stronger, it's not always the case. So the strongest people in the world are not necessarily the biggest people in the world, right? i.e. powerlifters being incredibly strong, bodybuilders being strong but not as strong, potentially the slightly different ways they train cause a slightly different type of muscle fiber hypertrophy. One being an increase in the contractile units, one being an increase in the non-contractile units, or probably more realistically just a slight change in the percentage that's coming from each that explains the muscle size growth. And we have some information, it's growing. Mike Roberts at Auburn, Cody Hahn are doing fantastic work in that area of sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. but we don't know yet, and we're certainly nothing definitive, so more research is needed. Or, in theory, it could come from myofibrillar hyperplasia or splitting. Now, again, that's not muscle fiber, but the fibrils themselves could either hypertrophy, which is probably unlikely, but they could also just simply be splitting, which is, I think, not shown, but I think is very, very likely. Okay? Now, I know I left you with a lot of things of mystery, and you're like, you didn't really explain it to us. Well, one thing I can tell you is we have been limited by technology for a long time, but those days are almost over. And so you can see an actual image of a laser I'm shooting into a muscle fiber right there. So the imaging technologies we're getting are becoming really, really high quality and really cheap. Well, cheaper. And so we're going to have an explosion of research in these areas that we've been stagnant in for 60 years. A lot of these questions I showed you, people have been asking again since the 60s or 70s or 80s at best. And I honestly think we're going to have answers in the next handful of years, barring any more worldwide pandemics and the West Coast burning and all this other stuff. So, nonetheless. So to summarize the physiology here, the fibers change in the pennation angle and they can lengthen. So that's that first one, right? So the length of them could get longer, and that would potentially be adding sarcomeres in series, although it's never really been shown specifically. That's what we think happened. Fiber hyperplasia or splitting is probably unlikely, certainly hyperplasia. I think splitting is likely, but more a long-term adaptation, not a short-term one. And then 3, fiber hypertrophies by increasing the sarcoplasm or the contractile, which could be coming from the myofibrillar hyperplasia or hypertrophy, but we don't know the details specifically in this area. So now that I've hit you with the very basics of what hypertrophy is, let's talk about how we maximize it. In other words, how do we make the body stimulate muscle growth? That's really what we're after. So let's jump into the quick version of part 2. Regardless of how the muscle grows, which we're still working out, we know that it takes a 4-step process to induce that growth, whatever part that is, okay? And so I call these the 4 steps to activating muscle growth. Number 1, you have to have some sort of stimulus. 2, you have to activate what we call a signaling cascade. That has to cause your nucleus to want to express the genes that regulate and control protein synthesis so that you can build this new protein, myosin, actin, myofibrillar, whatever it happens to be. So this is sort of what we call the central dogma of tissue growth, right, in general, but this is applied to muscle hypertrophy. So we'll go through each one of these steps fairly quickly. And the first one is a stimulus. I didn't say stimulant. Get it? Dad joke. Anyways, what we're talking about is something has to tell the muscle fiber that we need to get bigger, faster, stronger, whatever the case might be, right? And this happens at the level most likely of the cell membrane, or the outside of the muscle fiber. Now, in 2010, a young and up-and-coming scientist named Brad Schoenfeld proposed, and he said, hey, I think there's 3 main quote-unquote mechanisms or things that cause your body to induce muscle growth. And you don't necessarily have to have all 3. One would work. Maybe combining a couple is more effective or not. But regardless, either 3 of these are an option. And he basically said that could be either mechanical tension, which you could think of as the cell wall being stretched because it's being asked to lift something heavy. It could be metabolic stress. This could be fatigue, the burn. Oh my gosh, I'm feeling lactate buildup. All these things, right? Go watch my lactate video. That's not how it works, but I'm trying to help you understand the basics here. Or it could be muscle damage, right? I'm sore the next day. So, well, 10 years have now gone by since Brad's original study, and he just released another review, an update on what he thought last year. And so I explained that in depth in part 2 of that series, but here's the basics, okay? We know that, again, you imagine you've got a muscle cell, and these 3 little cylinders on the outside are different sensors, if you will. And we know a lot more detail about what these sensors are, what they're responding to, but here's basically what it would look like. You have what we would call mechanosensors, and these are the things that are going to sense the stretch, okay? So this is where mechanical tension comes in, or damage, or edema, right? So now we have a mechanism on the cell wall that is explaining both mechanical tension as well as muscle damage. Over here, you've got things like anabolic hormones, testosterone, IGF-1, etc. Now, we do know testosterone clearly plays a role in stimulating muscle growth. Anyone who's ever taken exogenous testosterone is very clear. Shocker, it works. Okay, look at Mark Bell. testosterone works. However, it is not a direct, it is not a linear expressor or inducer, if you will, of growth, such that if you do one type of workout and that causes you to have more of a testosterone surge than another one, that doesn't mean anything related to muscle hypertrophy. Similarly, if you take two people and one has more testosterone in their blood than the other one, that doesn't mean the person with more testosterone will get more muscle growth. So the post-exercise surge, if you will, so the increase of testosterone you get from an acute workout, it doesn't hardly do anything. In fact, the research would suggest it plays almost no role in causing muscle growth. This is why you don't see it on that original list from Brad, and I actually think the research is fairly clear here. It doesn't do much. So I'm not saying testosterone is not playing a part in muscle growth. It has to be there. Clearly, if you don't have testosterone, you will not grow. But once you've reached a certain minimal level, going higher in testosterone doesn't cause any additional growth, unless you go extremely high with things like exogenous or foreign testosterone. And now the concentration is just to such a magnitude that you would never see endogenously, and so you get muscle growth. The third one is what we call metabolic stress. And these are the sensors on your cell wall for things like lactate, hypoxia. Again, this is the burn, this is the pump. All of those things would explain how it can cause your muscle to grow. If that works and you get an adequate signal, step two, then you have to move into the cell itself. So the step one happened at the cell membrane. Step two happens in what we call the cytoplasm, so inside of it. And what you have to do then is activate what we call a signaling cascade. So you have a whole bunch of proteins whose job is to transmit a signal from those receptors or the cell wall all the way to the nucleus. Okay, because remember, the nucleus is what holds your DNA and controls your cell, tells it to grow, shrink, die, repair, etc. So there's a little protein, whatever it happens to be, and not even worth explaining to you what it's called, that sits on the cell wall or close to it. Something happens that activates that sensor, and of course there would be a protein right here and a protein right there. I'm just using this one for explanation purposes. That protein would activate another protein through things called kinases. This is the most common of these proteins is called mTOR, very highly associated with muscle hypertrophy. And again, we would generally call that cell signaling. In this case, since the cell signaling response causes muscle growth, we would call that anabolic. Anabolic meaning grow tissue size, right? One of those proteins would eventually hit the cell wall, or the nucleus wall, if you will, and it would then tell it and give it the signal that says, hey, we think you should start growing more muscle size. Like I said, the nucleus holds your DNA and tells it what to do. If that whole thing is activated, we get a certain response. So now cell signaling can kind of be, in this context, can be broken up into three major categories. Now, in reality, it's thousands of categories. You have signaling for all kinds of things. But for muscle growth, we have a whole cascade that causes the anabolic side. Okay, this is the AKT, mTOR sort of global pathways, we'll call it. We also have a catabolic, which is breakdown. And this is the FOXO and NF-kappa B and all this stuff, okay? But then you also have another one in the middle, which is an inhibitor. Doesn't cause growth, and it doesn't cause breakdown, but it blocks growth. And this is really important because this is how we make sure we don't grow tumors, right? So you want to have a gas pedal, you want to brake, right? And then you also want to be able to break down the tissue. So the catabolic side is important because once you've damaged tissue, you've got to break it down and get it out of there. Anabolic causes more growth. Inhibitors are, hey, let's stop growing because the growth is getting out of control, aka cancer or tumor. And the most famous inhibitor is myostatin. And this is, of course, like all these, they have genes as well as proteins, but you can Google around and read more about what myostatin is. But there are many animals and some humans now that have been found that are just naturally born with the mutation, and they don't have the gene or enough of the gene to code for the protein of mTOR or of myostatin, and so they don't have a lot of this protein floating around. And so they get this kind of uncontrolled muscle growth. And so these pictures you're seeing here they haven't been given steroids or antibiotics or anything you're thinking. They were just born with this crazy mutation, and so they just grow muscle nonstop. All right, pretty cool stuff. And for the record, they tend to live just fine. No damage. Okay, if you convince the nucleus to then grow, to do its thing, it's going to start expressing its genes. Now, and you can go back to molecular biology and remember what that actually means. But in the case of growing muscle, it would say, hey, we've got a whole bunch of genes that code for all kinds of things. Let's start coding and replicating the ones that make, say, myosin. And there's actually a study that came out just last year, fantastic, suggesting they think there's only about 141 different genes that are be associated with muscle hypertrophy, which is crazy considering there's like 20,000 genes or something. 141 is a very small number, but more is coming out of that. If you convince the cell to do that, the next level is then to actually go through protein synthesis. So you have to activate that process by using what are called the ribosomes. So the ribosomes are another little organelle that kind of would sit outside the nucleus, and you would take amino acids, you would put them together in the ribosomes. You know, amino acids slapped together makes a peptide. Take those together to make it a polypeptide, smash those together, you make it a protein. So the ribosomes are the ones that are really actually making your muscle bigger. So if you can imagine this being that myosin filament I talked about, it could be any protein, but just imagine it to be that. If you had enough amino acids around of the right ones, these ones would be the essential amino acids, and very specifically leucine drives this. But all of the essential amino acids are needed. So you would take them, you would send them to the ribosomes would start combining them together and start spitting out new proteins. So that process right there would be what we call protein synthesis. So you're bringing together, synthesizing proteins. Okay, so if you want to know whether or not you actually grew muscle, you have to balance the anabolic side with the catabolic side because both are going on. And so this is just a theoretical example of how you could increase breakdown of the muscle, increase the growth a little bit, and so your net balance would actually be negative. You would lose tissue here. Another way to do it would be, a massive stimulation of growth, a little stimulus there, and your net would be almost the exact same thing. So we have a totally different thing that happened, but the net result was almost identical. Or you could have something like this, and the net result could actually be negative. And so really pay attention to supplements or training programs or anything if they're saying, hey, we've studied this in a lab and shown our product increases muscle protein synthesis. Well, if you didn't pay attention to the catabolic side of the breakdown, then I don't actually know what the net result is going to be. And spoiler alert, all you care about is that pink part. What's the protein balance? Okay, so if you want to add muscle, as we finish up here, you have to do a couple of things. You have to train appropriately. And in part 3, the whole video, I explained to you what that actually means in painstaking detail. Why? Well, you have to give yourself a reason to grow. Okay, you have to do something that sufficiently activates the signaling cascade, sufficiently activates gene expression, and then sufficiently activates protein synthesis. But none of that's going to work if you don't eat appropriately, right? Why? Because you have to have fuel to do the actual training. If you don't have the carbohydrates or the fat or whatever you're using to power the workout, that ain't going to matter because you're never going to cause that cascade, unless, of course, you take testosterone. But then you also have the carbohydrates to power this process. So one of the things that we know is protein synthesis is very specifically powered by carbohydrate. So you want to make sure that those are available when you have the signal to grow or when that signal is maximized. But then you also have to have the building material, which would be the amino acids. So you have to have carbohydrates and fat to power the workouts. Probably carbohydrates optimally power the actual molecular process of building proteins, but nothing's going to get built if you don't have the amino acids around to be built in the first place. So if you were to look at this as a summary of bioenergetics as we wrap up, and let's say you ate some carbohydrates, and in your exercise physiology class you were taught about how that's broken down in the Krebs cycle, and you give off some carbon dioxide, you make some ATP, and you use that to do your sliding filament theory right there. Okay, great. You did that and that caused some sort of stimulus. Could have been tension, could have been damage, could have been stress. Regardless how it did it, it went to the muscle cell on the outside and caused some sort of activation of a protein. That protein activated another protein, and we globally called that signaling proteins. That went to the nucleus and said, hey, start expressing your DNA or your genes for muscle tissue. Okay, great. Then we went to the ribosomes and we started to activate this protein synthesis process. However, you also then, because you're a good, studious boy and girl, you had not only carbohydrates to power your workout, but you had some protein. The protein then aren't really used to make ATP. We use those as material. So those amino acids are floating through your body. Again, leucine and specifically the essential amino acids get taken up into the tissue. They're available. So when the ribosomes need them, they can start taking them breaking them down from their whole protein source into amino acids. The amino acids then go to the ribosomes and they can get added onto your new protein. And bada bing, you went from that to that. Now, I think I did a pretty damn good job. I've taken you through the physiology and the molecular mechanisms that signal muscle growth. And I stayed pretty close to this 25-minute mark. It took me almost 3 hours to do it in the other videos. So hopefully you enjoyed that condensed version. I'm tired. I'm going to go take a break. We'll see you on the other side. Cheers, everyone.